A voice, barely a breath yet sharp as splintered bone. "Don't go in there!" Ignored. They didn't listen, of course. The forest keeps its promises. Then came the turn. A seemingly insignificant deviation from the planned route. Suddenly the familiar tarmac gave way to something else. No signal. Beyond it, a trail, not a mark on any map they possessed. The morning arrived, crisp and imbued with an electric promise. Excitement hummed in the air, a tangible current amongst the 5 friends. Luggage, packed with optimistic care, found its place in the aging but steadfast van. The sprawling silhouette of the city began to shrink in the rearview mirror, a concrete world exchanged for open roads. They could not have known then the predatory nature of the wilderness that awaited, nor the true cost of their communion. Except, of course, for the one unforeseen variable that would irrevocably alter their trajectory, the fateful, unassuming wrong turn. The sun ascended its celestial arc, its golden rays generously warming the van's interior. A mesmerizing dance of light and shadow played through the leaves of the venerable trees that stood sentinel along the winding country lanes. Windows were lowered, admitting a refreshing, invigorating breeze that carried the scent of earth and grass. They sang with uninhibited enthusiasm, their voices occasionally straying from perfect pitch, but always brimming with pure, unadulterated joy. This, they felt, was the very quintessence of freedom. The ancient brooding woods harbored entirely different intentions for its unsuspecting visitors. As they ventured further, deeper into the embrace of the land, the essential character of the forest began to undergo a subtle, yet perceptible, transformation. The trees that flanked their path grew significantly taller, their limbs more gnarled and intricately intertwined, forming a dense, almost impenetrable canopy far above. The air itself grew cooler, carrying the rich, loamy scent of damp earth and the subtle perfume of decaying leaves. A primal quietude, heavy and expectant, settled around them like a shroud. The forest itself seemed to press in on them from all sides, its immense silent presence becoming almost palpable. It was Chloe who first registered the anomaly, her sharp eyes catching a discordant detail. A small, crudely fashioned wooden effigy suspended by a piece of twine from the low-hanging branch of an ancient gnarled oak by the roadside. "Look at that," she said, her voice noticeably quieter than usual, a note of unease coloring her tone. "That's a bit creepy, isn't it?" Liam slowed the van almost imperceptibly, his gaze drawn to the strange object, but he did not bring the vehicle to a complete halt. They all saw it. A fleeting, disturbing image, starkly silhouetted against the somber backdrop of the ancient trees. The first tendrils of a truly unsettling feeling began to take root in their minds. It began with such innocuous subtlety, a momentary lapse in concentration. Perhaps a road sign, obscured by overgrown summer foliage, was missed. The smooth tarmac they had grown accustomed to soon yielded. The transition was insidious, a slow bleed from the known into the profoundly unknown. They were no longer simply lost geographically, they were adrift in a sea of encroaching fear. Just as a tense debate began to surface, voices tight with blame and fear, they saw it. Looming from the dense undergrowth like a skeletal sentinel, a rusted gate. Its ironwork was twisted into grotesque, almost organic shapes, consumed by decades of neglect and encroaching ivy. It barred a narrow, barely discernible track that plunged even deeper into the shadowy woods. The gate was imposing, its presence deeply unsettling. It did not speak of welcome, but of boundaries violated, of secrets kept hidden from the outside world. It was a clear demarcation point, a line between the world they knew and something far older. A palpable wave of apprehension washed over the group. To turn back now seemed the only logical course of action, to retrace their steps, however difficult, and find their way back to a recognizable road. Yet, a strange, almost perverse curiosity began to take root. The trail beyond the gate, though dark and uninviting, possessed a sinister allure. Emily, usually so quiet, voiced what some were perhaps thinking. "What if this leads somewhere?" she whispered. "What if it's a way through?" It was a fragile tendril of hope, or perhaps a thread of fatal curiosity, pulling them forward. Liam cut the engine. The sudden silence that descended was absolute, almost deafening. It amplified the nervous thumping of their own hearts. Mark, ever the impulsive one, stepped out of the van. He approached the gate with a mixture of bravado and trepidation. He pushed against its cold, unyielding metal. With a prolonged, agonizing screech of tortured hinges, the gate grudgingly yielded. It swung inward, just enough to allow passage. The sound echoed through the silent woods, a mournful cry that seemed to disturb something ancient and unseen. The path beyond was dark, waiting. The trail itself was little more than a faint impression in the earth. Overgrown with weeds and choked with fallen leaves, it was clear that no vehicle had passed this way for a very long time. Yet it was undeniably a path. Someone or something had once trodden this route. The decision hung heavy in the air, fraught with unspoken fears. To venture down this forgotten track felt like a profound gamble, a step into a narrative from which they might not be able to extricate themselves. But the alternative, retracing their uncertain route, felt equally daunting. Slowly, fatally, the van lurched forward. They drove for what felt like an eternity, though the dashboard clock insisted it was merely minutes. The narrow track twisted and turned, each bend revealing only more dense, unyielding forest. The light grew dimmer still, the air cooler, carrying a damp, earthy scent. Just as despair began to truly set in, Chloe gasped. "Look!" she exclaimed, pointing through a small gap in the trees. There, nestled in a small, unnaturally silent clearing, stood a cabin. It was a dark, angular silhouette against the brooding backdrop of the woods. It was an unexpected punctuation mark in the endless green sentence of the forest. It was old, undoubtedly, constructed from rough-hewn logs darkened by age and weather. Yet, it was not dilapidated. Not in the way one might expect of a structure abandoned for decades to the mercy of the elements. The roofline, though moss-covered, appeared largely intact. The windows, though dark and opaque, were mostly unbroken. There was an eerie sense of preservation about it, as if time itself moved differently within this isolated clearing, or as if unseen hands had tended to its upkeep. It stood silent and watchful, a brooding presence. Liam brought the van to a hesitant stop at the edge of the clearing. The cabin exuded an almost palpable aura of stillness. No smoke curled from its chimney, no lights glowed from within its shadowed windows, no sounds of life, human or animal, emanated from its vicinity. Yet despite its apparent desolation, it did not feel entirely empty. There was a subtle tension in the air, a feeling of occupancy, however spectral. As they drew closer, on foot now, small details began to emerge from the gloom: a sagging porch, a single weathered wooden chair. The immediate surroundings of the cabin were as unsettling as the structure itself. The clearing was not natural. The trees seemed to keep a respectful, almost fearful distance. The ground was carpeted with a thick layer of pine needles and fallen leaves muffling their footsteps. It created an unnerving, absorbent silence. There was no garden, no sign of cultivation, save for a few gnarled, unidentifiable bushes. It was a place that seemed to have been carved out of the wilderness, and then, just as deliberately, forgotten by the outside world, or perhaps actively shunned. They approached the cabin with a mixture of trepidation and a desperate, flickering hope. Perhaps there would be people here, help, or at the very least shelter from the encroaching darkness. The front door was made of heavy, dark wood, studded with rusted iron. Mark, summoning a courage he perhaps did not truly feel, reached for the handle. He expected it to be locked or swollen shut with damp and disuse. To their collective surprise, the handle turned with an unnerving ease. The door creaked open, not with a loud protest but with a soft, almost sighing sound, inviting them in. A wave of hesitant indecision washed over them. To step inside felt like a significant, irrevocable commitment. A transgression. Yet, the alternative, spending the night in the van, lost in these oppressive woods, felt equally, if not more, perilous. Liam, ever the pragmatist, pushed the door further open. "We need to see if anyone's here," he stated, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "And check if there's a phone or any supplies." One by one they ducked under the low lintel and stepped across the threshold, leaving the relative familiarity of the dying daylight behind them. The air inside was surprisingly warm. Not the biting chill of an abandoned dwelling, but a lingering, almost recent warmth. It was heavy, too, and carried a peculiar, unidentifiable scent. A mixture of wood smoke, damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettlingly sweet. Dust motes danced in the few weak shafts of light that managed to penetrate the grimy window panes. The silence within the cabin was different from the silence of the woods. It was a contained silence, expectant, as if the very walls were listening to their hushed whispers and cautious footsteps. Despite the pervasive gloom, they could discern basic furnishings: a rough wooden table, a few mismatched chairs, a stone fireplace, its hearth dark and cold, yet with the distinct aroma of old ashes. There were no cobwebs draping the corners, no thick layer of dust coating every surface. It was as if someone had been there only recently, yet simultaneously it felt as though no one had truly lived there for a very, very long time. This inherent contradiction, the unsettling juxtaposition of recent presence and profound abandonment, sent a fresh shiver of unease down their spines. This place was wrong. "This is giving me serious Blair Witch vibes," Mark quipped, his attempt at humor falling flat in the oppressive atmosphere. His voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. No one laughed. The comparison, though intended to lighten the mood, only served to amplify their underlying fear. The cabin did indeed possess a disquieting aura, reminiscent of those chilling cinematic tales. Tales where curious protagonists ignored every ominous sign, where they blundered headlong into carefully laid traps. A nervous energy flickered between them, a shared unspoken acknowledgement that perhaps they should leave, now. Chloe, her eyes scanning the dim interior, noticed it first. Tucked away on a dusty mantelpiece, almost hidden in shadow, was a small, crudely carved wooden doll. It was similar in style to the unsettling effigies they had seen hanging from the trees along the roadside. Its features were indistinct, its limbs awkwardly splayed. It was not a child's plaything, it felt like a marker, a silent, sinister claim. She didn't touch it, but pointed it out with a trembling finger. "Look," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's like those things we saw outside, on the trail." Liam tried to rationalize it, to impose some semblance of normality onto the escalating weirdness. "Probably just old folk art," he suggested, his voice lacking conviction. "This place is ancient. Could have been here for generations," Sarah added. "Maybe previous hikers left it, or kids." But their explanations felt hollow, even to their own ears. They were grasping at straws, trying to weave a comforting narrative around a series of undeniably disturbing discoveries. The cabin seemed to absorb their weak attempts at reassurance, offering only its heavy, watchful silence in return. The warmth was no longer comforting, it felt cloying. Despite the mounting unease, despite the increasingly blatant warning signs, no one made a decisive move to leave. Perhaps it was the weariness from their misadventure. Perhaps it was the encroaching darkness outside, making the woods seem even more menacing. Or perhaps it was a fatalistic curiosity, a morbid desire to uncover the secrets of this strange, isolated place. They told themselves they would just rest for a short while. Regroup. Formulate a plan. They ignored the insistent, primal scream in their subconscious. The one that urged them to flee, to run far away from the cabin and never look back. The uneasy truce they had made with the cabin's oppressive atmosphere was fragile. It shattered with each new, unsettling discovery. Liam, attempting to find a source of water, or perhaps a working light switch, ventured deeper into the cabin's gloom. He found a small, crude kitchen area at the rear. A single plate sat on a rough wooden counter. On it, remnants of a meal, seemingly recent. Yet a fine layer of undisturbed dust coated the food. It was a paradox. A scene frozen in time, yet hinting at an interruption only moments ago. The air here was thick with the smell of spoiled food and something else. Something indefinably metallic. Sarah, meanwhile, peered through one of the grimy window panes. Her breath hitched. Just outside, half hidden in the overgrown weeds near the cabin wall, she saw them. More dolls. These were not like the one on the mantelpiece. These were larger, more grotesque. Their porcelain faces were cracked and stained. Their painted eyes seemed to stare with a vacant malice. Some were missing limbs, others had their synthetic hair torn away in patches. They were arranged in a macabre little tableau, as if mimicking some silent, sinister gathering. They looked like discarded playthings from a nightmare. A sudden noise from the far side of the cabin made them all jump. A distinct scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across a wooden floor. It was followed by a soft thud. Then, silence. Every nerve ending screamed. They froze, hearts hammering against their ribs, straining their ears in the suffocating stillness. Mark, his face pale, whispered, "What was that?" No one answered. The sound had seemed to emanate from within the cabin's own walls. Yet they had explored, or so they thought, every accessible room. The cabin felt small, but suddenly, it seemed to possess hidden, unknown depths. Their attempts to rationalize these occurrences grew increasingly feeble. This was not the work of playful teenagers. This was not simply an old, forgotten dwelling. There was a deliberate, unsettling artistry to the disarray. A curated wrongness, the lingering warmth, the recent yet decaying food, the watchful dolls. It all pointed to a presence, an occupant or occupants whose nature they could not begin to comprehend. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at them. It urged them to turn, to flee back into the fading light, but an awful inertia held them captive, a morbid fascination with the unfolding horror. It was Emily, her quiet nature often making her the most observant, who first noticed the drawings. They were not immediately obvious, etched faintly into the dark wood of the interior walls, scratched rather than drawn, with something sharp. At first, she thought they were just random marks, the mindless graffiti of some past inhabitant, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, patterns began to emerge, childlike figures, stick men and women, crudely rendered, but there was something profoundly disturbing about them. None of them had eyes, just blank, empty sockets where their eyes should have been. She let out a small, choked gasp, drawing the others' attention. They gathered around, their flashlights casting jerky, dancing beams across the unsettling artwork. The figures were depicted in various poses. Some were standing still, solitary. Others appeared to be running, their stick limbs flailing. And some seemed to be lying down. The eyeless faces, despite their simplicity, conveyed a sense of profound terror and despair. It was as if the artist, a child perhaps, had witnessed something too horrifying to fully articulate, something that had stolen their sight, or their ability to depict it. A wave of revulsion washed over them. Chloe felt physically sick. This is horrible, she stammered, backing away from the wall. The drawings were everywhere, they now realized, faintly etched on door frames, on the wooden shutters, even on the underside of the rough table. It was a silent, pervasive testament to some unspeakable suffering. The cabin, which had initially seemed merely old and strange, now felt tainted, defiled by a residue of past atrocities. The warmth they had felt earlier now seemed like the retained heat of some infernal process. Then, Mark's flashlight beam settled on a section of wall near the fireplace. Here, the scratching was different, deeper, more frantic. It was not a picture, but a word. One single word, repeated over and over again, gouged into the wood with a desperate, almost manic intensity. The word was feed. It was scratched in varying sizes, overlapping, almost consuming itself. The implication was immediate, visceral, and utterly terrifying. This place was not just a shelter, it was a larder. And the eyeless figures on the walls were perhaps not just art but a menu, or a warning. Their horrified examination of the walls was interrupted by Liam. He had been methodically checking the perimeter of the main room, his hand running along the wooden paneling. He stopped abruptly, his fingers encountering something that was not flush with the rest of the wall. "There's a door here," he announced, his voice tight. It was low, almost hidden in the gloomiest corner of the cabin, partially obscured by a tattered piece of sacking that had been nailed haphazardly above it. It was not a grand entrance, but a squat, forbidding portal made of the same dark, heavy wood as the cabin itself. Closer inspection revealed its most disturbing feature. The door was not merely closed, it was sealed. Thick, rusted nails had been driven through the edge of the door and deep into the surrounding frame. Many nails, dozens perhaps, and they had clearly been hammered in from their side, from the outside. This was not a door designed to keep something in, it was a barrier intended to prevent something or someone from getting out. Or perhaps to prevent anyone from discovering what lay beyond it. The implication sent a fresh surge of icy dread through their veins. "What do you think is down there?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a morbid curiosity that echoed in all of them. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken theories, each more terrifying than the last. A cellar, a storage space, or something far worse. The sheer effort involved in sealing the door spoke volumes. Whatever was on the other side was considered dangerous, or precious, or perhaps it was the source of the cabin's pervasive wrongness, the very heart of its darkness. A fierce, whispered debate erupted. Mark, ever impulsive, wanted to break it open. "We need to know," he insisted, his voice strained. Sarah argued vehemently against it. "Are you mad? It's nailed shut for a reason." Liam, torn, stared at the door, a muscle twitching in his jaw. As they argued, Emily put her ear to the wood. She recoiled almost instantly, her face even paler than before. I don't hear anything," she stammered, "but it feels cold, so cold." The silence from beyond the barricade was somehow more terrifying than any sound could have been. The oppressive atmosphere within the cabin eventually became unbearable. They needed air, a moment to think, to escape the claustrophobic intimacy of its secrets. They stepped back out into the clearing, but the encroaching twilight offered little comfort. The woods that surrounded them seemed to have drawn closer, the trees like dark, skeletal figures leaning in. It was here, in the dying light, that they noticed more signs of the cabin's grim purpose. Scattered near the tree line were several empty animal cages, rusted, some with their doors bent or broken. They were too small for livestock, too large for pets. The feeling of being watched, which had been a subtle undercurrent, now became an almost physical pressure. Every rustle of leaves in the faint breeze sounded like a footstep, every shadow seemed to conceal a watching presence. The forest was no longer a neutral backdrop, it felt alive, sentient, and deeply malevolent. They found a child's shoe, small and muddy, lying near the edge of the woods, as if dropped in haste. It was another small, heartbreaking detail in a tapestry of mounting horror. There were no other belongings, no other clues, just the shoe, a silent testament to a lost child. Suddenly a distinct crack of a twig breaking came from the dense undergrowth, startlingly close. They all spun towards the sound, their hearts leaping. Liam yelled out, "Who's there?" Only the soughing of the wind through the pines answered him. But for a fleeting second, Sarah swore she saw it, a flicker of movement, a tall, dark shape that melted back into the shadows almost before it registered. "There's someone out there!" she hissed, her voice trembling. "I saw them!" Panic, raw and primal, began to claw at them. They were exposed, vulnerable, The cabin, with its disturbing drawings and sealed door, no longer seemed like the worst place to be. At least it offered walls, however compromised. The woods, by contrast, felt vast, unknowable, and filled with unseen threats. Their paranoia intensified. Was the cabin a trap, or was it a temporary flawed sanctuary from something even more terrifying lurking in the forest? The distinction became terrifyingly unclear. They were caught between the devil and the deep, dark woods. The chilling realization dawned. The cabin wasn't just a place of past horrors. The horror was current. It was all around them. The word "feed," gouged into the ancient wood, was a visceral punch. It reverberated through the small group, extinguishing the last embers of naive hope. This cabin was no forgotten relic. It was a den, a place of dreadful appetite. The eyeless figures scratched into the walls now seemed less like crude art and more like a gallery of past victims, their silent screams absorbed by the very timber surrounding them. The oppressive warmth of the interior, once a peculiar comfort, now felt like the retained heat of a charnel house. Every shadow seemed to pulse with a hidden, watching life. The decision, when it came, was unspoken yet absolute. They had to run. There was no debate, no hesitation left. The chilling implications of the sealed basement door, the scattered dolls, the eerie stillness of the clearing, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. They were in mortal danger. Liam's face, usually a bastion of calm, was now a mask of grim determination. Sarah's eyes darted nervously towards the darkening windows, while Chloe visibly trembled, her hand instinctively going to her mouth as if to stifle a scream. Mark, for once, offered no glib remark, his usual bravado entirely stripped away by the palpable menace. The forest outside, once a symbol of their adventurous spirit, now loomed as a gauntlet they must somehow survive. Their only thought was the van. It represented their sole chance of escape, a fragile metal shell against the encroaching horrors of this forgotten place. They would have to navigate the treacherous, overgrown track in the fading light, a daunting prospect. But the alternative, to remain within these walls or to be caught by whatever lurked in the woods, was unthinkable. A frantic, whispered plan formed. Grab only the essentials, move quickly, stay together, do not look back. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing their intent, its shadowy corners deepening with a predatory stillness. Each rustle of fabric, each hushed footstep, sounded deafening in the charged silence as they prepared for their desperate flight. They cast fearful glances towards the nailed door, half expecting it to splinter open, disgorging unimaginable terrors. The crude drawings on the walls seemed to mock their efforts, the eyeless faces fixed in perpetual torment. The very air thrummed with a malevolent energy, a sense of being observed by something ancient and infinitely patient. Their escape was not just from a physical place, but from a growing, suffocating dread that threatened to paralyze them entirely. Soon, they would discover that the trap was far more insidious than they imagined. They burst from the cabin, a tight knot of fear and adrenaline, plunging into the rapidly fading twilight. The clearing seemed even more oppressive than before, the trees encircling them like dark, silent judges. Their breath came in ragged gasps as they stumbled towards the van, its familiar shape a beacon of desperate hope in the gloom. Liam fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped them. The metallic click of the lock disengaging was momentarily reassuring, a small sound of civilization in this primal wilderness. They piled in, limbs tangled, hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. This was it, their chance. Liam thrust the key into the ignition, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He turned it, a sickening, weak click. Nothing more. Just the dull, lifeless sound of a battery utterly drained of its power. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through their adrenaline-fueled urgency. No, 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 Liam muttered, twisting the key again and again with increasing desperation. Each attempt yielded the same heartbreaking response. Click, silence, click, silence. The engine, their steadfast mechanical servant, was dead, lifeless, as inert as the cold stones of the cabin's hearth. "What's wrong with it?" Chloe cried, her voice cracking with terror. "It was fine earlier." Mark, his face a mask of disbelief, leaned forward, peering at the dashboard as if willing the warning lights to spring to life. But there was nothing. No flicker of hope. The van, their symbol of escape, had become just another part of the trap. A metallic coffin in the dying light. The silence that descended after Liam's frantic attempts was heavier, more suffocating than any they had yet experienced. It was the silence of dawning despair. Sarah, ever practical even in her fear, suggested they check under the bonnet. Perhaps a wire had come loose, a simple fix. But as Liam fumbled with the release latch, a new, even more horrifying realization began to dawn on one of them. Emily, who had been staring out of the side window, her gaze fixed on the ground near the tires, let out a small, choked sound. It was not a scream but a whimper of utter defeat. She pointed a trembling finger. Their hope, already critically wounded by the dead battery, was about to receive its final, fatal blow. The forest watched, impassive. Liam, abandoning the futile attempt to start the engine, followed Emily's horrified gaze. He slowly got out of the van, his movements stiff with dread. He walked around to the side, his eyes scanning the ground. Then he saw it. The front tire was completely flat, its rubber skin sagging forlornly against the damp earth. Not just flat, but slashed. A long, vicious gash ran across its sidewall, clearly inflicted by a sharp instrument. A cold dread seeped into his bones, far colder than the evening air. This was no accident. This was deliberate, calculated. He moved to the rear tire. The same story, another brutal slash, rendering it useless. His heart sank. He forced himself to check the other side of the van, a grim procession of discovery. Both tires on the driver's side were similarly destroyed. Every single one, methodically, efficiently disabled. The realization struck them with the force of a physical blow. They were not merely lost or unlucky. They were being actively, intelligently targeted, hunted. The dead battery was unlikely to have been a coincidence either. Someone or something had systematically ensured they could not leave. A wave of absolute despair washed over the group, extinguishing the last flickering embers of their fighting spirit. They were stranded, utterly at the mercy of whatever unseen forces controlled this dreadful place. The woods, which had seemed menacing before, now felt like the closing jaws of a monstrous predator. Sarah began to weep silently, tears tracing paths through the grime on her face. Mark sank to the ground, his head in his hands, muttering incoherently. Even Liam, their resilient leader, looked utterly defeated, his shoulders slumped, his gaze lost in the encroaching darkness. The silence of the forest pressed in, broken only by Sarah's quiet sobs and the frantic thumping of their own hearts. The careful planning of their weekend adventure, their laughter, their shared dreams, it all seemed like a distant, naive fantasy now. This was their reality. A dead van, slashed tires, no signal, and an unseen enemy who was clearly steps ahead of them. The cabin, with its horrors, suddenly seemed marginally less terrifying than the vast, dark unknown of the surrounding wilderness. But there was nowhere safe. They were trapped, and the game, it seemed, was only just beginning. The crushing weight of their predicament settled upon them. The van, once their chariot of escape, was now a tomb of their hopes. As if drawn by some morbid instinct or perhaps a desperate, illogical search for any overlooked clue, Chloe found herself back near the cabin's porch. Her eyes scanned the rough wooden walls, the grimy windows, the sagging structure, and then she saw it. Tucked into a crevice in the wood, almost invisible in the deep shadow cast by the eaves, was a small, square piece of paper. It was a photograph, a Polaroid, its colors slightly faded. With trembling fingers, she pulled it free. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart seemed to stop. The image was shockingly familiar. It was them. The 5 of them, captured earlier that day, when they had first stumbled upon the rusted gate and the unknown trail. They were laughing, unaware, their faces bright with the naive excitement of their supposed discovery. Liam was pointing at something off camera, Mark was making a funny face. Sarah was looking at the map. Chloe herself was there, smiling. Emily was slightly apart, looking pensively into the woods. The most chilling aspect was the perspective. The photograph had clearly been taken from a distance, from within the concealing darkness of the trees. Someone had been watching them, stalking them, documenting their unwitting approach to the trap. This was not a random encounter. They had been observed, catalogued, perhaps even chosen. The realization was like a shard of ice piercing Chloe's heart. She let out a small, strangled cry, which brought the others rushing to her side. They stared at the photograph, their faces draining of all remaining color. The image was a taunt, a cold, calculated message from their unseen tormentor. It screamed of their vulnerability, their utter helplessness. Whoever had taken this picture was still out there, watching, playing with them. The forest was not just a backdrop, it was the hunting ground of a patient, calculating predator. The signs had been there all along, the effigies, the cabin, the unsettling warmth, but this photograph was the undeniable proof. They were not just lost, they were quarry, and their terror, it seemed, was part of the entertainment. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each one measured by the frantic pulse of their own blood. They strained their ears, listening for any sound from the forest, a shout, a whistle, the snap of a twig that might signal Mark's return or his distress. But the woods remained stubbornly, ominously silent. Only the sigh of the wind through the pines, like the mournful breath of some ancient beast, and the frantic chirping of unseen insects disturbed the profound stillness. The darkness deepened, becoming absolute, a tangible entity that pressed in on them from all sides, suffocating their fragile hopes. Liam paced restlessly, his torch beam sweeping arcs through the inky blackness, searching for a sign that wasn't there. Sarah sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slowly, her gaze fixed on the point where Mark had vanished. Chloe whispered prayers, her voice barely audible, while Emily remained unnervingly still, her eyes wide and vacant, lost in some internal landscape of fear. The camaraderie that had bound them so tightly now felt like a fraying thread, stretched taut by an unbearable tension. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe with imagined threats. Every rustle of leaves was a potential footfall of their unseen tormentor. As the hours crawled by, a gnawing dread began to consume them. Mark should have returned by now, or at least made some signal. The forced optimism they had clung to started to crumble, replaced by a cold, sickening certainty that something was terribly wrong. Liam made the decision they had all been dreading. They had to look for him. Armed with their dwindling torch batteries and a desperate flickering courage, they ventured a short distance into the woods, calling his name, their voices sounding thin and fragile against the immense indifferent silence of the ancient forest. They followed the faint trail he might have taken. They found his jacket. It was not discarded carelessly, nor torn as if in a violent struggle. It was neatly, almost ceremoniously, folded, placed with unnatural care upon a low-hanging branch of a gnarled, ancient hawthorn tree directly in their path, as if it were an offering or a deliberate, chilling message. Of Mark himself there was no other trace. No footprints in the soft, damp earth beyond that point, no signs of a scuffle, no broken branches, no telltale drops of blood. He had simply vanished into the oppressive darkness, swallowed whole by the predatory woods, leaving only this single, mocking token behind. The discovery of Mark's folded jacket extinguished the last faint embers of hope. It was a cold, deliberate act, a clear indication that they were not dealing with a wild animal, nor a simple accident. This was calculated. This was personal. They retreated to the dubious sanctuary of the dead van, their numbers diminished, their spirits shattered. Sleep was an impossibility. They huddled together for warmth and a semblance of comfort, starting at every nocturnal sound, their imaginations painting horrific scenarios of Mark's fate. The night was endless, a suffocating blanket woven with fear and the chilling presence of their unseen enemy. Dawn arrived, not with relief, but with a gray, cheerless light that revealed the stark reality of their desolation. The forest seemed to recede slightly, its shadows less absolute, yet its menace remained undiminished. It was Liam, his face haggard, his eyes bloodshot from a night without sleep, who saw it first. Scratched with brutal simplicity into the damp earth beside one of the van's slashed tires were two words: stark, unambiguous, chillingly clear in the morning's unforgiving light. The message was almost casual in its cruelty, a stark pronouncement from their tormentor. It confirmed their deepest, unspoken fears: one down. The letters were uneven, gouged deep as if by a sharp stone or a pointed stick. The message was not merely an observation, it was a taunt, a score being kept in some dreadful, sadistic game. Their unseen adversary was not just hunting them, it was communicating, relishing their terror, playing with them like a cat with cornered mice. The realization struck them with the force of a physical blow, driving the air from their lungs. They were no longer just lost souls who had stumbled into danger. They were designated victims, pieces in a horrifying, preordained narrative. The fragile illusion that they might somehow reason with their situation, or fight their way out, crumbled into dust. This was not a battle for survival against the elements, or even against a straightforward human threat. This was something else entirely, something that understood their fear, that fed on it. The folded jacket, the silent woods, and now this brutal message in the dirt. It all painted a picture of a cold, intelligent malevolence. They were being systematically broken, their hope eroded piece by piece. And the game, it was terrifyingly clear, was far from over. The forest watched, patient and hungry. The game had reached its dreadful crescendo. Hope had long since bled out into the forest floor. Only one remained, a solitary figure against the terror. It was not a choice but a primal instinct, a desperate final surge of raw adrenaline. She ran. Without thought, without direction. Her friends were gone, swallowed by the insatiable dark. Their fading screams were now just echoes in her mind. The forest did not mourn, it merely waited. This was not victory, it was a temporary reprieve. The undergrowth became a relentless, tearing enemy. Sharp branches clawed at her, ripping fabric and flesh. Her lungs burned, each breath a ragged, painful gasp. She dared not look back, fearing what she might see. The sounds of pursuit, real or imagined, spurred her onward. Every snap of a twig was a footstep gaining, every rustle of leaves a presence drawing near. She fell repeatedly, hands raw, knees bleeding, but the terror was a merciless, effective goad. She scrambled up again and again, pushed by sheer will. Through the suffocating blackness of the night, she pressed on. Mud sucked at her worn shoes, trying to claim her. Cold rain began to fall, chilling her to the bone. The forest was a vast, indifferent maze. It offered no solace. Each tree seemed a leering sentinel, each shadow a threat. Exhaustion gnawed at her, a leaden weight, but the memory of the cabin, of Mark, of the others, burned. It fueled her flight, a horrific internal inferno. She pushed past pain, past fear, past reason, driven solely by the desperate need to see the sun. Then a change, a thinning of the oppressive trees. A faint gray light filtering through the dense canopy. Dawn was breaking, hesitant and uncertain, and with it, a sound. Unfamiliar, mechanical. A distant rumble, growing steadily louder. Hope, a fragile bird, dared to take flight in her chest. She burst from the tree line, stumbling, covered in mud and blood. Before her, a ribbon of tarmac. The highway. She fell to her knees, raising a trembling hand, screaming for help, her voice raw and broken. The police listened, their expressions a mixture of pity and disbelief. Her story was frantic, disjointed, tinged with madness. A cabin that fed, friends who vanished, a game of terror. They were skeptical, yet duty-bound, they returned with her. She guided them back, or tried to, through the dense woods, to the place of unspeakable horrors, the forgotten clearing. But the forest played its own tricks, its paths shifting. When they finally reached the supposed location, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. No sign of a struggle, no trace of a cabin, no disturbed earth. The van, with its slashed tires, had also vanished. As if it had been spirited away by the very air. The ground where the cabin supposedly stood was undisturbed, covered in a thick ancient carpet of pine needles. The experienced officers searched meticulously for hours. They found no physical evidence to support her wild tale. No blood, no discarded items, no broken branches, just deep, silent forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. Her words, once so urgent, now sounded like delusion. The woods kept their secrets well, erasing all proof. She was treated for exposure, for shock, for hysteria. The official report would likely speak of trauma-induced fantasy. But she knew. She carried the truth in her haunted eyes. The images were seared into her memory, indelible scars. The eyeless drawings, the folded jacket, the words in the dirt, the faces of her friends contorted in their final moments. She was the lone survivor, a reluctant repository of horror. The world moved on, but she remained trapped in the nightmare that the forest had so easily erased. Her sanity questioned, her grief profound and isolating. Days later, a local hiker reported something peculiar. Near the main road, not far from where she was found, a new sign had appeared, nailed freshly to an old oak tree. It was simple, made of rough, unpainted wood. The letters were crudely carved, almost celebratory. A chilling promise to any who might stray from the path. It read, clear and bold in the dappled sunlight, "See you next season." The trap was not gone. It was merely dormant, waiting patiently for new players to arrive.